All right, hello everybody. Time to start part 9 of the critique and, examination of Rousseau's social contract. This time we're only going to be covering one chapter. We're covering Book 3, Chapter 1, titled Government in General. And, well, let's get started. Rousseau begins this chapter by warning us that we must read this chapter carefully. This is, of course, not a good sign. It is a sign that he has discovered that he has been being very unclear and very kind of double-speaky about things, and now he's like, well, no, I'm really going to get it right this time. He hasn't really demonstrated his ability to remain consistent and make sense at this point so far either, but let's play along, just for the hell of it, all right? Okay, first off, he posits that any action is the combination of two causes. First, what he calls a moral cause, which is basically a will. And when I say action, I mean like the action of a creature, of an entity that has a will, right? So any action requires, number one, what he calls a moral cause, which is basically the will behind the action, and then a physical cause, which is like the ability to actually enact that moral cause in reality using real things. So he gives an example of like a man choosing to walk across the room, right? In that case, the man's mind is the moral cause and the man's feet are the physical cause. And he gives further counterexamples of saying, well, if that man is paralyzed, he might want to walk across the room all he can, but he cannot, he doesn't have the physical force to do so. And then similarly, there could be a guy who just doesn't want to walk across the room, and then he has the means, the feet, but he doesn't have the moral cause. So far, this isn't particularly objectionable. Again, Rousseau is starting off the chapter with things that sound vaguely reasonable. Is it another trap? Let's find out. Rousseau then claims that, quote, the legislative power belongs to the people and can belong to it alone, end quote. The executive power, in contrast, can only consist of specific acts, decrees, enforcement, etc., which fall outside the scope of the sovereign, quote, whose acts must always be laws, end quote. Now, the main problem here is that realistic systems generally have the people delegate the legislative power to a body of legislators as well. Rousseau has even talked about legislators and having them be separate from the people as a possibility. And Rousseau has even said that it's a good idea for legislators to use subterfuge and propaganda to undermine the morals and customs of a people. That's Book 2, Chapter 12. We just covered that. That they should do that if the legislators perceive that the general will approves of that undermining, which, of course, the general will can never really be measured. It's worth remembering, there's no way to actually tell what the natural will is or the general will is. Natural will. I wrote natural will in my notes for some reason. I'll have to fix that. General. What the general will is, we can never measure that. Rousseau continues, the general will is the moral cause behind actions of the state, but it needs a physical cause in order to implement its desires. This necessitates the existence of an intermediate body which Rousseau calls government. Okay, now we have a problem because we're attributing a real will to a fictional person. We've done this before, but now Rousseau has gotten to the point where he's like, well, no, this thing can want to walk across a room kind of thing. And it's like, well, what? Again, the problem with this is that it's something that can never be measured. So the intermediate, whatever the intermediate is, this government that Rousseau's talking about, it's either going to be operating off of guesses, in the best case, right? That it makes the best assumptions at the time and acts on them, or it's going to act on personal preference. Now, guess which one is likely to happen in the long term? Well, we've got Hayek's Why the Worst Get on Top to let us know where that's going to go. Rousseau continues with some very weird definitions. He calls the members of the government kings or governors, and then the body of the government as a whole he calls the prince. He tries to justify this within the text about talking about a particular college or something like that is called the prince when it's out of session or something. I don't know. but it sounds to me like it's another set of unnecessarily confusing terms that have new definitions, despite having old definitions that conflict with their usual old meanings. This, of course, what it basically does is it muddies the discourse, making it harder to nail down Rousseau's arguments. And of course, Rousseau hates to have his arguments nailed down. That's why we need to read so carefully this particular chapter. Now, here's Rousseau borrowing something from Locke. He says that the people employ a prince in order to physically enact the desires of the general will. He basically states that the creation of a government is an act of employment by the people and not like some kind of contract or yada yada yada. This is pretty similar to the Lockean, or it might be post-Lockean, concept that the government should be an agent or a servant of the people as opposed to the people serving the government, right? And that therefore, since this is an agent or a servant, powers are delegated to it in order to achieve certain ends. This is basically kind of Lockean or near post-Lockean kind of thought. The problem with Rousseau's conception here is that the general will is unknowable, and therefore the power, and also he said that the power of the state, which means the government, is basically unlimited, and therefore its ends are uncertain and not likely to coincide with what the people actually want, if such a thing is actually a real concept. Rousseau continues, quote, "I call then government, or supreme administration, the legitimate exercise of the executive power, and prince or magistrate the man or the body entrusted with that administration," end quote. Rousseau keeps using this supreme language whenever he's also arguing that the failure of government to aim at certain ends that can't be measured also dissolves its authority. This is very confusing. The problem is that no group of citizens in Rousseau's system can ever prove that the general will is not being served, right? You can't point at it's not like a system with a written constitution where a citizen can point at words on a page and say, you did X, this said you shall not do X, hey, somebody help me out here, right? At least there's some kind of, evidentiary point to be made. But in Rousseau's system, there can be no such point. The power of the general will is unlimited, and the power of the government is infinite. And not only that, but if we look at Book 2, Chapter 7, which we covered a couple parts ago, Rousseau says that one of the things the government ought to do is to render its citizens into helpless, dependent serfs, which, of course, means that even if they are right, they can't defend themselves except by appealing to government power. And if government power is what's oppressing them in the first place, well, they're kind of screwed. Rousseau notes that orders flow from the sovereign to the government to the individual people. And so the sovereign makes law, the government interprets the law, turns that law into edicts and commands, and sends those edicts and commands and decrees to individual people or individual groups of people. This is, of course, what you would kind of need, right? You need to convert this law to action. Fair enough. This makes logical sense, except that the starting point is kind of this nebulous non-entity, and all of Rousseau's arguments aren't making it any more clear what it actually is. Now, he continues, if any of these three, sovereign, magistrate, or subjects, try to usurp the positions of the others, quote, the state is dissolved and falls into despotism or anarchy, end quote. But by this criterion, states dissolve all the time, practically instantly. I mean, Locke relented into allowing taxation, prerogative, dominion, conscription, etc., because he feared that without them, states would rapidly dissipate. Even relatively good states might. Rousseau, on the other hand, has created a standard that cannot be measured, right? But which any deviation from results in the immediate dissolution of the state. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It means that practically all states are illegitimate, but there's no way to prove that they're illegitimate, and also you've already given up pretty much all of your power to them. It's an ephemeral entity that that Rousseau also claims is indivisible, all-powerful, and permanent. It doesn't make a whole lot of logical sense. But we're going to continue his quote. Quote, as there is only one mean proportional between each relation, there is also only one good government possible for a state. But, as countless events may change the relations of a people, not only may different governments be good for different peoples, but also for the same people at different times, end quote. These are basically pleas for good government without any actual advice or limitations or ideas. It's basically useless rhetoric. Rousseau then discusses the effect of larger populations on the state. He notes that a citizen in a state with 10,000 people has 1/10,000th part of influence, and that proportionally a citizen in a state with 100,000 people only has 1/100,000th part of influence. Therefore, he says, the larger the state, the less the liberty. This seems rational, but it leads to the conclusion that Rousseau doesn't seem to be aiming for, that larger states are worse in general. It's also not true if your aim is for a strictly limited state, whether that ideal can be achieved or not. It reeks of totalitarian thinking, as if the state is going to micromanage every action of every citizen, which is, of course, morally repugnant and economically suicidal. We remember that in, I think it was the previous part, Rousseau talks about the state telling people which types of commerce to engage in order to maximize their utility. But there's not really any reason for that to be a thing that the state does, right? The whole point of the argument of Smith's invisible hand is that you don't need to be forced to do what's good for you. You just need to be forced to not do what is detrimental to those around you, basically. Rousseau then goes into this extended metaphor using mathematical jargon, but he soon notes that these things to which he's giving mathematical jargon can't be measured to the necessary accuracy, and therefore the math language is effectively a metaphor, and any attempts to ridicule his system by picking at this mathematical language is an invalid argument. Pro tip, right? Don't start a metaphor if you're just going to abandon it. Even more important, don't use a metaphor and then claim that no implications or extensions of that metaphor can be valid criticisms. That's just bad argumentation. It's special pleading, basically. Rousseau goes on. You know, that whole chunk of the chapter, it's about a paragraph and a half, just talks about like means and ratios and stuff. And in the end, he says you can't gather anything from this other than what I've said, so it basically nullifies itself. But after that, he states that as population increases, particular wills are more likely to differ from the general will in larger ways, and thus, quote, the more should the repressive force be increased. The government then to be good should be proportionally stronger as the people is more numerous, end quote. Now there is an element of truth here, right? Larger groups of people tend to incorporate more disagreements. However, the solution is not to progressively tighten the noose, as it were, on everybody, but rather to expand the sphere of actions that people can take without government interference, up to the point where the only things that are really forbidden are aggression, fraud, etc., the laissez-faire system, basically. The whole point of the classical liberal movement, Locke and Sidney and so on, is that the more differentiated groups of people you have, they'll have different opinions. The more differentiated, that if you have a group of people that is more differentiated from each other, they can still live in harmony under the same government if that government does not play favorites on issues where the groups have differences. If everybody agrees that on issue A and everybody disagrees on issue B, then a government that chooses a side on issue B can never serve one side of the people. On the other hand, if the government, works on things where everybody has agreement and keeps a hands-off approach on things where people have disagreement, then that government can serve both groups without necessarily harming either. That's kind of the ideal of the classical liberal framework, and Rousseau doesn't have any of that here. But he continues. As the force with which the government is endowed to keep the people under control grows, so should the force of the sovereign, quote, for keeping the government in hand, end quote. But since the sovereign is a fictitious person with no real existence, there's not really any way to increase the force it wields. All force that it wields through the government. All that can be done is to increase the power of the government, which inevitably leads to certain groups within the body politic kind of becoming permanent minorities, with all the problems that entails. People will hijack the government for their own purposes. You get civil unrest, you get rebellion, you get assassination, etc. Rousseau continues, quote, the government is on a small scale what the body politic which includes it is on a great one. It is a moral person endowed with certain faculties, active like the sovereign, and passive like the state, and capable of being resolved into other similar relations, end quote. This adds yet another fictitious moral person into the mix. It's also worth noting that Rousseau's definition for sovereign and state from Book 1, Chapter 6 are actually in conflict with this new metaphor. From the earlier chapter, I'm going to quote, the republic or body politic, quote, is called by its members state when passive, sovereign when active, and power when compared with others like itself, end quote. This is not the same thing that he's talking about now, which, doesn't lend much to his argumentative goodness. He summarizes, quote, let us rest content with regarding government as a new body within the state, distinct from the people and the sovereign, and intermediate between them, end quote. They're intermediate between something which does not exist and cannot be measured, and a group of helpless and dependent husks with no power or wealth. Even if the general will could be measured, what stops such a body from becoming a pack of usurpers? If they were to become a pack of usurpers, would there be any objective criterion by which a group of people could use to determine whether the government is acting as a pact of, is acting as such, or whether they're usurpers or not? There's not in Rousseau's system. At least in a Lockean system with a written constitution, checks and balances, etc., rules, these things are at least possible. In Rousseau's system, all of the rules are completely fluid. There's no clear decider of what the government is supposed to do, and in fact the government is supposed to have unlimited power. It doesn't point in a good direction, we'll say that. Rousseau continues, the government only exists through the sovereign as an executor of its general will. Quote, thus the dominant will of the prince, which remember is the body of the government, is or should be nothing but the general will or the law. His force is only the public force concentrated in his hands. And as soon as he tries to base any absolute and independent act on his own authority, the tie that binds the whole together begins to be loosened. If finally the prince should come to have a particular will more active than the will of the sovereign, and should employ the public force in his hands in obedience to this particular will, there would be, so to speak, two sovereigns, one rightful and the other actual. The social union would evaporate instantly, and the body politic would be dissolved, end quote. Now that's a long one, but it doesn't say much. All it says basically is that government should be good, and should do only good things. If not, society is dissolved. By these criteria, no government in history was ever legitimate for long. And if that were the case, Rousseau would have just said so and called it a day. Instead, what he says earlier is that perfect or ideal governments indeed have very much power and may very long persist, and that all of the bases for judgment are not something that anyone can measure or prove. But he continues even further. The government must have, quote, a true existence, a particular personality, a sensibility common to its members, and a force of will of its own, end quote. Rousseau claims that this calls for the existence of groups and privileges which subdivides the government and gives offices honors in proportion to their difficulty. At this point, the institution of divisions and fiefdoms within the government might actually help. It might direct the malice of the government at other parts of government rather than the people, a little brief respite for them. Then he says, the government should always be ready to sacrifice itself for the people, and never the people to the government. And how many government agents should be able to dance on the head of a pin? Look, the system of separation of powers, written constitutions, checks and balances, etc., proposed by the classical liberals are not perfect. If I thought they were, I'd be a classical liberal and not an anarchist. However, they are a far sight better than this nebulous pile of utopian gibberish. Nobody needs a writer to tell them that governments ought to be good. Even the monarchists believe that governments ought to be good. The question is what the good is and what the governments ought to be able to do. The question is how to deal with this special moral status that governments typically enjoy, the ability to do things like taxation and conscription and still have the approval of the people in general. And then we also need to distinguish when that moral status has been nullified by egregious actions of government. That's the path that we need. We need a path for a legitimate government and what makes it legitimate. We need a path to determine what powers it has, and then we need a path to determine if and when it has overstepped its boundaries and lost the status that it has as a state. Rousseau is providing none of this. He's created these artificial persons based on some vague combination of a bunch of individuals, assigned that non-existent fiction a will, and vested unlimited power into a body to enact this hypothetical will. He posits that the sovereign is always right, but there's no way to actually measure what this phantom actually wants. Therefore, the people can have no way to demonstrate that the actual real agents of the state have violated its will. He basically creates a totalitarian state and says it ought to do good, and then leaves the people no strength to resist it. Unless he turns something around really soon, it appears that this is just a garbage ideology that's designed to twist the ideals of limited government back into absolute control. But he continues. The government, despite being an artificial body that is the work of another artificial body, still has vigor and, quote, more or less robust health, because adding on yet more vague descriptive criteria will help at this point. He continues, the, quote, various relations, end quote, between the state, government, and body politic can result in a good or pernicious government depending on how those relations stand at any given time. Yet bad governments that overstep their bounds, that do not enact the general will, instantly dissolve the body politic? Obviously, Rousseau's assertion that the body politic dissolves instantly under such conditions is not something that he genuinely believes. This is the first chapter of Book 3. And what are we getting out of it? We're getting out of it that Rousseau is kind of trying to hijack the language of limited government to create an unlimited government. He's completely inconsistent about his perspective on when governments dissolve, because he says that governments dissolve instantly if they do not put forward, do not promote the general will, but at the same time, the general will is not something that can be measured in any concrete way. He talks about how, well, the body politic dissolves, but the state has already taken most of the wealth and power that any of the individuals in the body politic has. It doesn't... I mean, Rousseau is famous for talking about how institutions are bad, per se. That people are born good and institutions make them bad. That's not true, but if we try to go along with it arguendo, what he's basically saying is that all government is an oppressive, what would you call it even? Like an oppressive tyranny or autocracy, and that there's no way for anyone to measure when a government is good, and therefore there shouldn't be any government. But he's not saying that as a result. That would be the conclusion that you would get from reading these things, but he's already said things like the government is indivisible, the government is, continues permanently, the government this, the government that, and not government, but state, right? But the state is just kind of this nebulous non-thing. He says that the government should always obey the general will, but there's no way to determine what the general will is except by voting, and that's not a particularly good, choice oftentimes. He gives the state absolute control over the people, but then he says that governments need to get more and more powerful as populations get larger in order to, basically repress the people's differences even more. It's very weird. And if he were actually writing this from an anarchist perspective, it would make more sense. He would basically say, let's assume that this general will thing exists. Since we can't know what it is, there's no way for a government to actually obey it. And since there's no way for a government to actually obey it, any group that tries to grab onto that power and claim that it is the general will is probably a usurper and should be overthrown. That would be a perfectly good argument to make based on the kind of framework that he's building up. But he doesn't make that argument, and I don't understand why. Anyway, we're going to continue probably chapters 2 and 3 next time. Chapter 2 is also a long one, so I'll see how long my notes on it are when I actually get into it and start writing down all the little bits and pieces that Rousseau is writing. But this is part 9, book 3, chapter 1, Government in General. And again, as we've seen already, it's not a very good sign for Rousseau's framework making sense. What we seem to be narrowing in on is that Rousseau's framework is a way to use the language of limited government to create a despotism. And that's kind of very reminiscent of what the U.S. has done, right? The U.S. was kind of built on Lockean or post-Lockean ideals, right? And then in failing those ideals, it has become kind of a Rousseauian state. And the next stage seems to be a completely, what would you call it? Like a bureaucratic state, a completely untethered to the people's will bureaucratic state, like they have in the European Union, for instance. It's just not. It's not giving us any answers. It's just giving us more questions. And, the purpose of these kinds of books should be to put down a framework and look at where that framework may do good and where it may do bad, and explain how to encourage it to do good and discourage it from doing bad. Rousseau isn't doing any of that. He just kind of creates these imaginary constructs and then says, oh yeah, well, whatever it wants, it should get, but there's no way to measure that. I don't know. Anyway, that's part 9. Next part next week. We'll see how it goes. And I think there's 4 books in the social contract, so we're more than halfway through, I think, because the latter 2 books I think are shorter, but we'll see. Anyway, have a good week, everybody, and I will see you next time.